Being bilingual or multilingual, that is, being able to understand and speak two or more languages, comes with many perks, and some of those advantages can be seen in the fields of code switching and translanguaging. On this video, we'll explain the concepts of both terms, as well as the difference between the two, the historical background, researches that had been done on both fields of study as well as the results, and their practical applications in language teaching.
Te ves divina en esta foto. I really never saw these wedding pictures, Mama. How handsome and young Papa looks.
Ay, it makes me sad.
Ay, I know that you miss him.
No, look at my ass. There were two things in that picture I don't have anymore.
Ay, Mama, qué loca. Sonia, can I help you?
No, she's fine. It keeps her busy.
In this fragment of a scene from the TV show Modern Family, we can see a clear example of code switching. But first of all, what is code switching? It is the alternation of two languages within a single discourse, sentence, or constituent. And it is also important to note that the speakers taking part of the conversation are competent and understand both languages. Code switching can also be classified into three different types, which are the extrasentential, intersentential, and intrasentential code switching. The extrasentential code switching is to insert tag elements from one language into an otherwise monolingual discourse in another language. The intersentential code switching is characterized by a switch from one language variety to another outside the sentence or the level clause. And the last type will be the intrasentential code switching, which is the switch from one language variety to another at the clause, phrase, or word level within a single utterance. Now let's identify them in the video we just watched. An example of the extrasentential code switching happens in this sentence in the conversation. The daughter says a full sentence in English and inserts the word mama at the end. The intersentential code switching can also be seen in the video, as an entire sentence is in Spanish, just to be followed by another one in English. The intersentential code switching isn't present in the scene, but an example of it will be in the sentence Abelardo tiene los movie tickets. Many researchers now think that the act of code switching is governed by rules instead of just being done randomly. Poplak claims that there are two main restrictions in which switching can happen: the free morpheme constraint and the equivalence constraint. The free morpheme constraint is in which the speaker must not switch language between a word and its endings, unless the word is pronounced as if it were in the language of the ending. That is, an English-Spanish switch, like runeando, is impossible because run is distinctively English in sound, but flipeando is possible because flip could be a Spanish word. Now, the equivalence constraint is a rule that says that the code switching between L1 and L2 won't violate a syntactic rule of neither of both. Another approach to code switching is the matrix language frame model, in which there's a distinction between the two codes. The matrix language, which is the dominant language and provides the morphosyntactic frame for intrasentential code switching, and the embedded language, it being the language from which elements are inserted into the matrix language. Translanguaging, which is a newer field compared to code switching, was originally the term referred to the pedagogical practice of having students alternate between languages depending on whether they were using them receptively or productively. However, many scholars have extended and expanded the concept, defining it as slightly different. In more recent years, one of the main researchers on the topic has been Ofelia Garcia, who conceptualizes translanguaging as the act performed by bilinguals of accessing different linguistic features or various modes of what are described as autonomous languages in order to maximize communicative potential.
Translanguaging is the use of the children's full linguistic repertoire to make meaning without thinking of the fact that they have one language that is different from the other. So bilingual children have one language system with linguistic features that, of course, are associated with one language or the other, but they also learn to suppress certain features depending on the communicative situation in which they're at.
Translanguaging in the classroom is where two languages are used in an integrated and coherent way to manage and facilitate the mental process of learning, whether by teachers or by students. Translanguaging has been seen as part of a movement in education from monolingual to multilingual education and a modern model in bilingual classrooms. It is an action designed to access different linguistic features to augment communication. It is not merely using the two languages, but also making meaning and gaining understanding and knowledge through the integration of those languages. Before moving on to the next topics, we should establish what the difference between code switching and translanguaging is. Kahiani, citing Garcia, establishes it by saying that translanguaging can be initially defined as the practice of shuttling between languages in a natural way. However, translanguaging differs from code switching in that it is not merely switching in and out of two separate monolingual codes, but combines two languages as a unity to achieve effective communication. Translanguaging posits that bilinguals have one linguistic repertoire from which they select features strategically to communicate effectively. Thus, the focus in the concept of translanguaging is not on the languages but on the observable communicative practice of bilinguals, taking bilinguals rather than monolinguals as a norm.
Code switching has likely gone on for centuries, but while it's gone on forever, it wasn't studied or discussed much in the US until relatively recently. In the entire first half of the 20th century and in large parts of the second half, code switching was considered something that occurred randomly, without a logical pattern behind it, as a result of imperfect second language learning. In the 1940s and the 1950s, many scholars considered code switching to be a substandard use of language. The perspective on code switching began to change in the 1970s when Bloom and Grumpers published an article in which they presented a survey of their studies of a Norwegian village. Bloom and Grumpers discovered that members of the village spoke two dialects of Norwegian and used them according to specific situations. In the following years, more scholars conducted research on the systematic character of code switching. From the late 70s on, there has been a lively debate going on, producing various models predicting code switching. Attention to code switching was further boosted by the resurgence of Spanglish, the commingling of Spanish and English languages. While Spanglish has been spoken in pockets of America for centuries, since Spanish speakers arrived at the continent well before the Pilgrims, the more recent influx of Mexican immigrants that began in the 1990s caused Spanglish to become more widespread. And with 54 million Hispanics in the US as of 2013, it's here to stay. So, the study of code switching will likely continue to expand and evolve, just like code switching itself. The term translanguaging comes from the Welsh Translanguaging and was coined by Sam Williams in the 1980s. In its original use, it referred to a pedagogical practice where students are asked to alternate languages for the purpose of receptive or productive use. For example, students might be asked to read in English and write in Welsh and vice versa. The term Translanguaging was translated into English as translanguaging by Colin Baker. The ideology behind translanguaging emerged from the evolution of multilingual teaching practices, particularly the practices promoted by teaching English to speakers of other languages, abbreviated as TESOL, an international association designed to advance the quality of English language instruction. In the late of 1970s and 1980s, second language education shifted to focus on the importance of communication and language use for participants' discourse communities. However, emphasizing language learning to enter a discourse community was also problematic, as it pursued students to surrender their own language practices in order to become practicing members of the new discourse communities. Scholars argued that translanguaging functions as an emancipation from the adverse second language acquisition pedagogies of the 20th century. They believe that translanguaging gives multilingual students an advantage within educational systems, because it promotes a more thoughtful understanding of context. It helps the development of the weaker language for bilingual or multilingual speakers. It fosters home-to-school links within language use, and it integrates fluent speakers with early learners, thus expediting the language learning process.
The first research I'm going to talk about is titled Reasons for Code Switching in ELT Classrooms at Anadolu University by Irem Sag. This study focused on the students of ELT in Anadolu University in Turkey and the modes behind code switching in class between English and Turkish. Data was collected through an online questionnaire in which the students had 10 reasons for code switching, and in each mode they ranked it if they did it or not. The research found that the most popular reason for code switching in class is for the lack of equivalence of Turkish words in English, followed by telling a joke that will lose meaning in English and to explain something they don't know in English. The least popular reasons were to show they were part of a group, for attention, and to create conflict in class. The second research I'm going to talk about is called The Study of the Perception of Code Switching to English in German Advertising by Anna B. Siganova. This research was focused on advertisement in Germany and the usage of English in German ads. Siganova surveyed over 150 German-speaking people on what they think about a slogan that used both German and English, and if they prefer the one in English or a version in German only. The results showed that half of the participants preferred the one in German only, while the rest was divided between liking both and the one in English. Only 2 people didn't like both slogans. Most of the participants felt the slogan with English didn't feel genuine, while some thought it was trying too hard to be modern, or it comes off as a foreign product trying to get into the German market. These 2 studies show a different perspective towards code switching. In one case it focused on why people code switch on a certain situation, while the other focused on how people react to code switching.
There was a research conducted by Molly Champlin in 2016 in order to research the impact of the use of translanguaging strategies has on bilingual learners and discover whether or not these strategies support their English language development. Data was collected during lessons taught, interviews with students and teachers, questionnaire feedback, and participation in a collegial circle. Findings revealed that translanguaging did promote the growth of students' English language development. Findings also show that teachers use various translanguaging strategies in their classrooms, but only some are confident about the positive effects of these strategies. Implications from this study implicated that teachers need to be formally trained in order to using translanguaging in class, and supported in their use of these strategies in alignment with current language policies and programs. Another study conducted by Bimbai Hamwe in 2018 provided evidence to show the importance of cultivating and encouraging students to use all the languages at their disposal for meaning making and a deeper understanding of text. Paraphrasing is a tool that can be used together with a translingual approach to help students grasp the meaning of text. The results show that when students are accorded the opportunity to freely utilize the linguistic resources at their disposal, they are able to comprehend text. It is also important to mention that although participants in this research use a translingual approach to help them to understand the article, they eventually were able to produce paraphrases in English that showed that they had understood the paragraphs that they paraphrased already. This confirms that the use of more than one language enhances understanding as opposed to causing confusion in students' mind. He recommends to teachers the use of a translanguaging strategy in their classrooms to help students understand text. It is also important to teachers to introduce different learning strategies that will help students to understand text. This includes the use of translanguaging.
Practical applications in language teaching. Code switching. There are 2 central ways to approach code switching: the correctionist approach and the contrastivist approach. The correctionist approach is defined as the approach teachers use when acknowledging that proper English is the only form of language appropriate in the classroom. The contrastivist approach is defined as the approach teachers use when communicating to the student that their home and school language are important to their identity. Generally speaking, most professionals argue against using the correctionist approach because it is considered to be negative. Sometimes, code switching may be seen as lazy, but not always. In multiple occasions, it is very useful, and even though it is a good tool in class, we must set rules for the use of this. Times when we can use code switching to explain difficult topics. While explaining subjects like grammar, they may be difficult things to explain, and saying in the student's native language makes things easier. To build a harmonious place. It is known that students learn better in warm and welcoming places. So if a student feels in a supporting and comfortable place, it takes a better communication between teacher and student. To make instructions clear. When there is not enough time and you need your students to have very clear instructions, you retrieve to their native language for better results. Equivalence. It helps students learn the words correctly in English. Reiteration. Students repeat the phrase they understand in the native language. Then, translation and comprehension will be clearer. Floor holding. When the student may not have the words in English, so they switch to maintain the conversation. It is taught to reduce the new language fluency over time by reducing the perception that one needs to strengthen vocabulary to improve communication. If a teacher does not understand the cultural background of students, then he or she cannot sensitively approach this topic. Translanguaging. It is the only way to create meaning while learning. It is the one thing that everyone needs to do in order to successfully develop their languages, develop their ways of knowing, to develop content, develop their social and emotional identities, and for society to develop a more just and equitable society. Professor Ofelia Garcia. Times when we can use translanguaging. Label objects in the classroom in multiple languages. Give students of all language abilities a time to shine. By emphasizing both languages in a positive light, it allows all children to learn new vocabulary and creates an encouraging learning environment that fosters all students regardless of their native language. Stock your classroom with age-appropriate books and multimedia resources in the language of your students. If possible, use bilingual books and digital content that shows two languages side by side to help students make the connection between their native language and the second language. When grouping students for collaborative work, allow students with the same native language to work together. This allows them to receive a full and deep understanding of the assignment. Allow students to engage with each other with their home language so that students can deeply discuss a text in the dominant school language later on with all their language resources. Learn keywords in your students' native language. Creating an environment that allows the use of their native language and experiences combined with other students' language and cultures. All students can reach their full potential. Any teacher, including a monolingual one, can take up translanguaging to enable their bilingual students to make deeper meaning and legitimize their home language practices. Professor Ofelia Garcia.